Hello, welcome to your Black History class. The name of the book is, of course, From Slavery to Freedom, A History of African Americans. Chapter 1, Lesson 1, and your first chapter is called Ancestral Africa. When you get right down to it, most of our knowledge and even the opinions we have of Africans and Africa have been colored by information from previous missionaries and explorers. During the 1800s, Americans were very intent upon sending missionaries to their heathen brethren, because whenever you thought about Africa or Africans, this is pretty much the picture that came to mind. And with the great explorer Henry M. Stanley, and when he wrote of his African experiences, he titled his book In Darkest Africa. The famous 19th century missionary David Livingstone believed that he was taking the gospel to a very backward people. In more recent years, of course, our knowledge of Africa has all too often been influenced by movies and myths. Even Alex Haley's book Roots sometimes suggested a very scantily clad people living in a jungle. So just how much of this ignorance about Africa remains? Well, it wasn't until the mid-20th century that American scholars began writing about Africa with any knowledge and sensitivity. And I want to stress to you about the diversity of the African people. But do you have any idea of the vastness of the continent? Did you think that Africa was one large nation rather than the scores, as you can see by the multicolored different countries? And of course, they change, seems like yearly. But they have different cultures and different languages, and there's different degrees of technological expertise. And some people saw the early Africa when it was backward and uncivilized. Others had a rather romantic view, a pastoral view of a state where everyone lived happily and farmed and took care of their cattle until the dastardly white Europeans arrived. So which is the truth? Well, in reality, there's a little bit of truth in both of those visions. When the Europeans arrived, they did find some states in Africa had Iron Age technology. And some states were very heavily involved in the gold trade as early as the 10th century. And some states were in a state of not going anywhere. And before we get into the text material, I want to spend a few minutes on generalities and background. Now here is a close-up view of the African continent. Now, this is what, I do the same thing in Kentucky history. There's part of Kentucky in the north and east, it's a little hump. I call it the humpy-back camel of Kentucky. This is a hump of Africa. And of course, right in through here is where we're going to be focusing all of our attention. Now, over here, this is Egypt. Here's the Nile. This is the Red Sea, and the Nile runs down through here. But when you think of Egypt, you, of course, think of Cleopatra. And Egypt, of course, we know is in Africa. Now, in my personal opinion is that before you can begin the study of any subject, you need to take a look at the background. So before we can really get into the history of slavery in the United States, we need to look at the homeland of the slaves. And of course, like I say, we know about Egypt. We all know we got our slaves from Africa. And of course, the area is supposed to be very big on deserts. And with all the recent events in the news, we are now aware of how widespread the Muslim religion is. But what about life? And how did they get their name, and what does it mean? Well, the name is lost in the past, but we believe it's either from the Greco-Roman time when the Romans referred to their colonial provinces in Tunisia and eastern Algeria, the northern coast along the Mediterranean, as Africa. And we believe the word means sunny. In Latin or Greek, Africa means without cold. Now, both of those would describe the weather conditions quite well. And of course, it could have even been Semite, which referred to the area as a land of ears of corn. But whatever the word, the interior was called dark or black because of the unknown and the color of the skin of the inhabitants. A little background on Africa itself. Now, Africa is the second largest continent of the 7 continents on the earth, Asia, of course, being the largest. But Africa is bounded by the Atlantic Ocean on the west, the Indian Ocean on the east, the Mediterranean Sea on the north, and the Red Sea on the northeast. It covers over 11,000 plus square miles. 11 million, I'm sorry, not 11,000, 11 million. There are 53 plus countries, and of course, well, some of them are, well, shall we say, disputed. The ones we are more familiar with are the largest one called Egypt and Sudan. The highest point in Africa is Mount Kilimanjaro in eastern Africa. And Mount Kilimanjaro is 19,000 plus feet tall. But it has no mountain range, they're just isolated mountains. Lake Victoria is the largest lake, covers over 26,000 square miles. There are a couple of other large lakes, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi, and Lake Chad. However, the one that most people seem to be familiar with, and you hear on questions on Jeopardy, etc., are Lake Victoria. They have rivers. The longest river in Africa is the Nile, which runs over 4,000 miles. The Congo, the Niger, the Zambezi Rivers are other rather important rivers, and they're not nearly as long nor as wide and well known as the Nile. We'll learn a little bit about the Congo and the Niger in our studies. And of course, then there's the deserts. And the main reason I put this, or the juvenile map up there, is to show you exactly where the Sahara Desert is. It covers what, almost 1/4 of the continent, 1/4 of the continent of Africa. The largest and the hottest in the world is the Sahara, located in northern Africa, covering over 3 million square miles. The Kalahari Desert down to the south is another large desert. It will be large by any standards, but compared to the Sahara, nothing. And of course, then you have the little island of Madagascar right here just off the southeast coast of Africa. And just FYI, during World War II, that's where Hitler wanted to settle the Jews, is in Madagascar. And you're going to hear some words that you don't know the meaning of. Some of them are history words, some of them are endemic to Africa. And you're also going to come across some situations that we're going to talk about and discuss that are going to be disturbing to you. Both, it doesn't matter whether you're a white student or a black student, they're going to be disturbing. But remember, you're here to learn. You're not here to judge or condemn. Now, if we were on campus, I would tell you as you come into the classroom, leave your personal opinions and your judgments on the outside of the classroom door. But since you're going to be doing this either at home or in the library, I would say that as soon as you hit enter to enter the lesson, forget your previously held views and open your mind and learn. And hopefully it'll make you a better American and make you a little bit more understanding of our fellow human beings. Now, Afrocentrism, strange word, but it simply means the outlook or worldview centered on Africa and African descendants. And the real radicals, well, you know, they have it in Europe too, Eurocentrism. They believe that everything that's any good or that has ever come out invented was from Europe. That's pretty much what the African-centrism is. The revisionist historian recasts world history from the African point of view, such as insisting that Aristotle the Greek stole all of his philosophies from the philosophies of Egypt. See, Socrates and Cleopatra were black. There's also the claim that it was the Egyptians that invaded Greece, not Greece that invaded Egypt. And of course, in its very radical form, it's connected with the black supremacy movement and includes the notion that the African contributions to world history and culture and race are superior to the contributions of any people from any other continent. So how did this come about and why? Well, there are a lot of different cultures on the continent of Africa, and there's many shades of skin color on many different languages. Now, I personally believe that it began back in the 18th and 19th centuries, brought on by all that European imperialism and racism, and it continued in the United States as a way to instill black pride in the early 20th century. And of course, there is a historical debate over it, but just like there is over the United States Constitution, is it a radical document written by white slave owners? Or was it written by wealthy, educated men who were trying to do the best for all the citizens? Now, it doesn't matter which side of the argument you're on, you're sure that you're absolutely right. And, that's okay. Because if everyone had the same opinion, it certainly would be a very boring world and no need to do any research of any kind. So, why do I even bring it up? Because I'm sure that some of you have heard these claims, and we're not here to debate, to prove, or disprove. We're here to study the history of African Americans and slavery. To get into a discussion of that, we'd have to spend several class periods on just the history of Africa, which I would love to do, but we do not have the time. That being said, we're going to jump ahead a little bit to the 20th century. Dr. Carter G. Woodson. You may be familiar with his name, and you may not. I'm going to call him Carter for the first few minutes. Now, Carter was a son of slaves, and he spent his entire childhood working in the Kentucky coal mines in the East. He didn't even get to go to high school until he was 20 years old. But because of being homeschooled and eager and mind like a sponge, he graduated in 2 years and went on to study in the higher education, and he even went to Harvard and got his PhD. But while he was there, he was, shall we say, a little disturbed to realize that the history books that he was studying, well, they just seemed to ignore the presence of the Black Americans. And if they did acknowledge them, they were always in an inferior position. So he decided to do something about it. So he began writing Black Americans into American history. And he established the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1916. A few years later, he established a Journal of Negro History. And then in 1920, well, it's supposed to be 26, but I won't ask you the date, so it's not 25, it's 26. He launched a Negro History Week as a way to bring national attention to the contributions of Black peoples throughout American history. Of course, it's become a month-long celebration now, which next month is Black History Month. He chose the second week of February because it marks the birthday of two men who greatly influenced the Black American population. It would be Frederick Douglass, a former slave, and of course Abraham Lincoln. February does have a lot of significance in Black American history. For example, and I've just given you a few, February the 22nd, 1868, W.E.B. Du Bois was born. He was a very important civil rights leader, one of the co-founders of the NAACP. We even use some of his books in philosophy still. He was a very brilliant man. He was born free in the North. Unfortunately, he didn't understand the mindset of slavery and owners in the South, which is another story. February the 3rd, 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, which gave the newly freed blacks the right to vote. February the 25th, 1870, Hiram Revels, the first elected Black U.S. Senator, took his oath of office. February the 12th, 1909, the NAACP was founded in New York City by a group of concerned Black and white citizens. On February the 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated by 3 former Muslim members. No, they weren't former Muslims, they were former members of the Black Muslims. And I'm sure if we looked, we could find an awful lot more. A little bit of background on the continent before we get into the actual text. Now, BCE, before Common Era, means the same as BC or before Christ. Common Era means the same as AD or after death. Now, we have not changed the time frames as these names indicate. We've merely changed the labeling of them. And why? Because we've become a very politically correct nation, and we do not want to offend anyone who's not a Christian. And let's face facts, BC and AD are very religiously indicated because of Christ. That being said, tens of thousands of years ago, Africa was not the arid desert we think of today. It wasn't until about 4,000 years before Common Era that a climate change caused what used to be the fertile Sahara region to lose its fertility. The rivers began to dwindle and to perish. The lakes began to disappear. And the peoples that lived there simply moved elsewhere. So you begin to see a separation of the peoples of Africa. Those remaining in the northern area around the Mediterranean Sea and along the western and eastern coast were to continue to have contact with Europe and the Muslims. And they would even incorporate some of their ideas and into their own life. But those in the center of Africa and even further south begin to develop their own cultures without any outside influence. So the Sahara began to offer what we call a major barrier to human passage about the same time that the peoples of Africa began to move around and to multiply. Now, this barrier is going to very much influence the way the cultures are going to develop. And although contact never stopped completely, and you hear today about the contacts along the Red Sea in Egypt, the areas that the Romans conquered, but you don't hear much about the other side of Sahara. There was prosperity in the north. They even had chariots. It was a very common occurrence. And there was culture and laws. But when most people think of Africa of the past, they think of black men running around half naked, throwing spears, and having no law or civilization. And I am going to completely shatter that idea. I'm not saying that if the Sahara had not developed and grown and spread, that Africa would have developed along the same lines as Europe and the Mediterranean. But because the very nature of the continent, the forms of vegetation, the temperatures, they imposed a very unique pattern of development and would have regardless. But why did early civilizations appear along the Nile River Valley in the Near East and Mediterranean in Mesopotamia along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers? Well, think about it. River valley cultivation. That seems to be the biggest clue. The earliest civilizations all began their rise in great river valleys, and no matter how much they differed in culture, custom, or religion, they all had some form of irrigation, and every year from floods from their rivers, they had renewals of the soil. Now, once man was able to stop hunting and gathering, in other words, end his nomadic life, and begin to stay in one place and grow crops, in good weather especially, he would have a surplus of food. And with surplus of food, they would begin to grow a trade, commerce. And with commerce, there comes a permanent settlement, a division of labor, growth of cities, and a central government. And yes, that all seems very simplistic, but when you get right down to it, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes decades or centuries, but that's where it starts. When you've got a surplus of food, you begin the path. Now, the people of Africa were unknown for centuries, except for a few adventurous souls that traveled south. And of course, the stories they brought back, well, they exaggerate them and glorify your own experiences. So it's only been in the last few decades that serious attention has been paid to African history. Now, for centuries, Africa was known as a dark continent, a land of fabulous golden legends. And of course, I'm sure you've heard of these stories of King Solomon's lost spines and the treasures of Timbuktu. I think one of the Indiana Jones movies was about the lost treasures of King Solomon. And when I was young, we had movies after movies after movies, people looking for the lost gold mines of King Solomon. And over the past 200 years, those legends were slowly replaced by a different type of belief. A belief that Africa was a land without a past and without a history. That its people had always lived in savagery. And the numerous and very impressive archaeological traces of early African civilization were either ignored or attributed to a lost people. An example of that would be when the Europeans first arrived in Kentucky. And they saw those big mounds built by the Mississippi Indians. Of course, they said the Indians did not have the intelligence or the know-how, so this had to have been built by a race of lost white men. Maybe it was the lost Atlantans, or maybe the lost tribe of Israel. But let me assure you, there was a civilization. It was highly developed and purely African in origin and character. I wish we had more time to spend learning about African history, but as it's very beautiful and very mysterious, but unfortunately we're only going to be able to spend enough time to learn about the homeland for most of the slaves that came to this country. Now, here's something called a word listing. Now, you're going to either hear these words in the lecture, you've read them in the text, and you should be familiar with them and know a word or two to be able to identify them. I've been told over the semesters that sometimes I talk too fast, and sometimes the PowerPoint goes too fast for the students to get what they need. So, although we will have a lecture with a PowerPoint behind it every lesson, there'll be another segment under the content area in your Blackboard where it says PowerPoints. There I post the PowerPoint with no audio behind it, so you can go as slow or as fast as you like. And at the end of the lecture, you can go back to the word listing and print out the word list, because you do need to know this. Now we're going to get into the chapter. What I've told you previously is none of it is in your text. Now, of all the Earth's continents, 7 of them, Africa provides us with the longest, deepest record of human past. And it may well have been in Africa where modern forms of humans first emerged. After all, Africa today is referred to as the cradle of all humankind. Now, archaeological records document the development of many different regional groups of people, each with their own technologies and local cultural styles, but the long and complex prehistorical records extends far beyond the reach of written historical records or even oral traditions. And they all help shape the ethnic identity of the modern-day African people. After more than some 600 million years of evolution, there is evidence in East Africa dating more than 4 million years ago of upright walking ancestors. And by 2.5 million years ago, we begin to see evidence of behavior patterns, which we are going to call the Stone Age. That age is usually divided into early, middle, and late. And there were very rapid changes in the tools that they used and in the behavior patterns. And then beginning approximately 100 to 150,000 years ago, which in historical terms is just a blink of the eye, while we surmise that these people were still hunters and gatherers and did some scavenging, we begin to see evidence of all areas of the continent of Africa having some form of inhabitation. And by using the word surmise, of course, we have no written or proof records. We have to take the archaeological evidence that we dig up and compare it to what other tribes and other areas of the world did, and just basically, yes, form a theory. But it's been proven to be pretty much true. Now, roughly 5,000 to 4,000 before Common Era, food productions in the form of agriculture and herding was introduced in Africa. And herding is just a fancy word for saying, we have more than one cow or one pig. You've got several of them. Now, we believe that this came from the Near East areas. We have no proof, but we surmise this. Iron technology was introduced sometime within the first millennium before Common Era from the Mediterranean Sea area. It wasn't long before the Africans began to develop their own techniques, which were, in all fairness, superior to what had been brought in. So ironworking began to spread into West Africa by the 1st century before Common Era. Ironworking centers began to develop, and with these centers came large populations. And when you have a large population, pretty soon you're organizing and you have a chiefdom, or before you know it, you've got a kingdom. And you usually have a very hierarchical social stratification. Everybody can't be the boss, We also begin to see craft specialization, very well-developed artistic traditions, evidences of long-distance trade, and even campaigns of conquest for their neighbors. So food production and ironworking spread to Central and Southern Africa within the last 2,000 years. But iron-using food producers, which is a fancy college way of saying people are no longer using sticks to plow the ground, they're using iron tools. These people begin to replace the stone-using hunter-gatherers who are still using stone clubs to hunt. Well, that is if you lived in a region that was suitable for agriculture. If you lived on a mountaintop or in a wet valley, of course, you can't have agriculture. Now, between 10 and 20,000 years ago, what we call later Stone Age populations in Africa began to, shall we say, exploit specific plants and animals that were available to them in their own regions. Herding began to be focused on a few species of wild plant gathering on just a couple of plant types. And they used these long sickle blades to cut the grasses. Now, in case you don't know what a sickle blade is, think about the Grim Reaper. He, has this long pole with this curved blade at the end, or maybe Father Time at the end of the year. When we lived on a farm, believe me, I have seen that used, and there's also the hand one that you use for your yards. And no, I didn't live 20,000 years ago. So the sickle blades were used to cut grasses, and they used grinding stones to process grains. And we found evidences of this, especially in the northeast Africa. Some of them date back as far back as 10,000 years. But there is no evidence of this type of domestication of wild plant species in the Nile Valley. A domestication of an animal or even of a plant involves the breeding or the cutting and melding together of species until its characteristics become altered from their wild state and bringing it more into line to what you need. Like I said, Egypt was not the first. There was a number of populations during this later Stone Age, and they appeared to have adopted this domestication process, usually with their locally available plants, such as yams, rice, millet, sorghum, and even the oil palms. The types of animals they had were sheep, goats, and cattle, and they even imported camels from Asia. FYI, just as a throw something out, the donkey, hee-haw, and the pussycat were actually domesticated in Egypt. Now, it may seem a little strange, but the very most important region of food production in prehistoric Africa was the Sahara Desert region. You see, after the last of the glaciers appeared, there was a period of rainfall and lower evaporation in that region that lasted for almost 4,000 years. And the Sahara was loaded with lakes and ponds and rivers, and it supported a huge population. And around 6500 BCE, the peoples in that area even began to develop the making of pottery. Now, I'm not going to go into the development of Egypt or the Sudan to the south, both along the Nile, incidentally. Our primary interest will lay along the western coast of Africa, as I pointed out earlier in that hum. But just to mention a couple of things, we do know that the domestication of cattle began to spread south of the Sahara about 3000 to 4000 BCE. And we have found pottery remains and ground stone axes in West Africa that date between 5,000 and 4,000 years BCE. But as far as technology is concerned, the making of tools out of copper and bronze developed in West Asia before 3000 BCE, but it never really took hold in the Africa, except in a few of the northern regions. The iron smelting technology, after it was introduced to North Africa, began with the Phoenicians around the 8th century BCE. So why would you use something as softer as copper, when you knew how to make iron? As I say, the Phoenicians arrived. And the Semitic-speaking people began to immigrate from southern Arabia into the Ethiopian highlands during the first millennium in the BCE. And by the 1st century Common Era, they had even established an extensive state reaching across much of Ethiopia and Sudan, or into central North and Central Africa. Meanwhile, Egypt has come under the influence of the Greeks and the Romans by 30 BCE. Christianity began to move into northern Africa and spread by the 4th century into Ethiopia and Nubia. Christian villages even flourished after the expansion of the Muslims into northern Africa, and they were cut off from the northern centers of Christianity. But by the 8th century, we began to see the development of other things. Number one, the Arabian invasion of the 7th century Common Era brought in the religion of Islam, and it took hold rapidly in North Africa, especially in the area west of Egypt. So using camel caravans going south, the Arabians spread Islam to much of the sub-Saharan Africa. They developed networks that began to involve local Iron Age societies, and with that they created large urban centers. And when you've got a large urban center, you've got centralized political power. And once you have political power, they begin to regulate things, and they did begin to regulate the trade. The networks first involved the people of the Savannah regions to the south of the Sahara. And by the mid-8th century, there was the powerful state of Ghana, then Mali, and then Songhay. And these are the three that we're going to do the most talking about, which are located and began in that little hump of Africa on the west. Now, when you get right down to it, and if you haven't figured it out already, I'm sure you will very quickly, that the chapters are very short. And your first chapter, Ancestral Africa, is not that long, but it covers 3 states, the 3 I just mentioned, pretty much in detail, and then mentions briefly some others. Now, you do realize that the use of the word state does not indicate a state like Kentucky is a state. State used here is meant as a specific area of territory that has an organized body of people who rule, usually a single ruler, a sovereign, a king, or a chief. So the area on the west, I don't know if I've got a map. Yeah, I do have a map. And here we can see it a little bit better. So here's the Senegal, here's the Niger River we keep talking about, right in this area right here. Most of the settlements along the Senegal and upper Niger rivers was where they were starting. And like I mentioned earlier, as a matter of fact, that's where civilization began for most peoples along the rivers. Using them for transportation, a source of food, protection. But in the earliest beginnings, the territorial boundaries of Ghana were very loosely defined. Now, we have no written evidence, but there is an oral tradition that Ghana's existence began back in the early Christian era. As for the leaders, it seems that the offices were hereditary, and Ghana's social order had come together and become very well organized. As most were villages or small towns, and the natives of Ghana were farmers, and they were so until the droughts began to cause the desert to expand into their lands. But before this happened, there was an abundance of crops and sheep and cattle, and they were able to maintain a very healthy trade with the other peoples in their area. And their main town was Kumbi Saleh. Here's that again. Very briefly, as I said, here you got the Nile River. That's the lower Nile. Coming all down here, this is the upper Nile. You got the Red Sea, you got Egypt in through here. There's Saudi Arabia, the Mediterranean. There's Spain over there. Morocco and Libya up in here. But this is the area we're concerned with. About the 10th century Common Era, or the 900s, the Muslim influence began to show up, and the religion was gradually adopted. And some say it was because of the Muslim faith. They recognized the nationality of the child by the nationality of the father. So children born of a mixed marriage would have been born Arabian and Muslim, unlike in the United States when the origin of the child is determined by the nationality of the mother. And if the mother's a slave, the child's born a slave. Now, under the Muslim influence, the power of Ghana grew and expanded. The Muslims brought not only a different religion, but a different way of doing business. And prior to this time, most trading had been done by a system of barter. But the Muslims demonstrated how to trade up for better and different goods. Isn't there a television show about trading up where somebody goes out and has one thing and he has to end up with something 3 times its worth by just trading up? Well, the people of Ghana had ivory and gold and textiles and brass and pearls and salt and slaves. And at the 10th century, the king of Ghana was Muslim. And because of this very lucrative trade they had, he also had become the leader of a rather large army. Now, of course, you have dynasties. As I said, the rulership was usually hereditary. And it was under what they called the Sisi dynasty that Ghana reached the peak of power. They were so powerful that the other tribes in the area paid tribute. And Ghana even began to use gold and trade with the Moroccan caravans from the north along the Mediterranean. And even the big cities such as Baghdad and Cairo, they were talking about Ghana. They knew who she was. Now, an example of wealth and power is your text picks Tenkan Menon, who in the 11th century uses him to demonstrate the tribe's wealth and the taxes and how they were used. The rulers lived in a very fortified castle that had windows decorated by artists, and they had beautiful pictures and sculptures. The grounds of the castle were gardens that housed temples in which the native gods were worshipped, and they had very lavishly decorated tombs of the former leaders. The king was the head of the religion, or the chief priest, as you would. Now, all this was before the Muslim influence came. And it was during this reign, Kinkaminin, that a band of Muslims called the Almoravids invaded. They seized the capital and introduced their religion to the people. Anytime you are invaded, of course, there's turmoil. And there's conflict. And the conflict resulting from this invasion, combined with a series of bad weather, droughts, it caused Guyana to go into a period of economic decline. Now, when they were very rich and very powerful, of course, they were envied and feared by their neighbors. But as soon as the decline started, they became easy prey to other tribes or other states. And during the 12th and 13th centuries, they were destroyed. Now, this is an example of some of the ruins that we found. Now, look at this. Doesn't it look like the Greek and Roman temples? Do you really think that a black man wearing a loincloth, carrying a spear, could have built something like this? Give me a break. No. They were educated. They were architects. They knew how to do things in northern Africa. They had no need of something like this in southern Africa. I'll get off my soapbox. Your next state we're going to talk about is Mali. Now, Mali had the beginnings about the same time as Guyana, but she stayed small and she was kind of insignificant until around 1240. Then, under the ruler of a man named Sudete Kente, they overran the former capital of Guyana and accepted the Muslim faith, and Guyana, in effect, became Mali. But it would be about 70 years later, under a successive group of rulers called the Mansa Musa and members of the Kiti dynasty, that the empire really grew. During this time, the Muslim religion grew, although the peoples were predominantly agricultural. There were those who engaged in trade, and the rulers had control of a very profitable gold mining business. And being good, pious Muslims, the rulers made their annual pilgrimages to Mecca. And it was during these pilgrimages they would check out what's going on in the rest of their state. There would be huge caravans filled with gifts to bestow along the way, as well as in Cairo and Mecca. Sometimes there would be thousands of people and hundreds of camels in the caravans. So the reputation of the wealth and power of Mali spread far and wide in West and North Africa. When Mansa Musa died in 1337, Mali was still extremely powerful and very organized as a political state. Even years after his death, a traveling Arabian geographer reported how impressed he was with the discipline of the officials, the excellent condition of the people, and the condition of the public finance, and the respect the people had for their officials, and they were so religious. Now, I want to remind you of the time, the 12th century, the middle 1100s. Europe was no more organized and kids playing baseball, nor wealthy as Mali, as she was in what we call in European history the Dark Ages. Backward, uneducated, dirty, diseases, the Black Death. Not looking good. But as so often happens, in the 15th century, there began to be signs of decline starting to show. And just as a wounded animal is prey to those stronger, just as Mali had overrun Guyana, now it was Mali's turn. The kingdom of Songhay began their attacks. Songhay. Well, just as like I said, as Guyana and Mali began as small states, so did Songhay. But it was under the influence of the Mali rulers for a time and actually vassals of the Mansa Musa. They bided their time, waiting for a weakness to think so they could make their move. And they began to make their move in 1355. Sonni Ali became leader of the Songhays in 1460s. Between those two times, they were, nitpicking and guerrilla raids and, pick. So Sonni Ali, he decides the time's right. We're going to conquer not only Mali, but the entire Niger River region. So what's he do? He builds a navy. He conquers both banks of the river. Now, somehow or another, when you think of war in Africa, you don't think of a navy. At least I didn't. I thought, a navy? Because in your mind, you see the Sahara Desert and you see camels. You don't see the big rivers where they can actually sail boats. But Sonni Ali was quite a warrior, and he was very successful. So in less than 9 years, he had gained control of the entire Niger River region and Mali. But some people were not too happy with this because Sonni Ali was not a Muslim, and his years of rule were spent fighting to defend his title. And when he died, Songhay was the dominant power in West Africa. But a year after his death, his dynasty was overthrown by a General Asia Mohammed. And he was going to rule from 1493 to 1529, which is exactly 26 years. And he was Songhai's most brilliant ruler. He began to use his energies to strengthen the empire and to make the people of Songhay prosperous, make the people of Songhay prosperous. And one of the programs he initiated was the encouragement of education. He began to build up his army with paid professionals of slaves and former prisoners and left his people to do their own thing. Reminds me a bit of Athens. They began a conquering campaign of the surrounding smaller states, and Songhay soon became the largest and most powerful state in the history of Africa. When Asia Mohammed would make his pilgrimage to Mecca, he didn't do as some of the former rulers had done, showing ostentatiousness and bearing gifts to everyone. He spent his time asking questions and recruiting professionals to come back to Songhay with him to help strengthen his kingdom. Now, just a few of the changes that he incorporated. He began to use the Muhammad laws and the Quran for his legal system. He improved the banking and credit system. He subdivided his kingdom and appointed carefully chosen men to administer them, which is one of the smartest things he can do. He instituted a uniform system of weights and measures. He established and encouraged schools everywhere. He encouraged trade with other countries, and he established universities in Timbuktu that became a draw to students from Europe and Asia in the areas of law, literature, and surgery. Not loincloth wearing, spear chunking men, are they? But here again, all good things come to an end, and King Asia Mohammed was overthrown by his eldest son, and soon thereafter began a decline in the prosperity of Songhay. Again, a sign of weakness, and someone's waiting to pounce. And in the late 1500s, the Moors from Morocco, with the help of Spain, overthrew the Songhay state and began their rule in Timbuktu. Some of the other smaller states it names in your text, of course you figured out, and I've told you that those three states, Ghana, Mali, and Songhay, are the ones that we're the most interested in and where we're concentrating our attention, but we are going to mention some of the others. And I love that one of Ouagadougou, which is commonly known as the Maasai States. It was founded in the middle of the 11th century. Never was very large, located just to the south of that bend in the Niger River. But it was densely populated, and its people were fiercely independent. For a while, there were 5 different states loosely combined in a federation there. But the strength of the Maasai people lay in their political and highly effective military system. And their emperor was absolute. There was no arguing with him. They even managed to repel attacks by both the Mali and the Songhay. But I think the thing I found most interesting was they did not have a standing army. But they were so well organized that a large army of trained, able-bodied men could be called up at a moment's notice. I guess you would compare it to our modern-day National Guard. The next one that's mentioned, well, I'm just showing you Africa. Here's the bend in the Niger River. Here's the South Bend. It'll be down in this area. Afno are the Hausa people. Now, it has been reported that at one time there were as many as 7 different smaller states involved in the Hausa people. Kano, Zara, and Katsina. And they were located in the area roughly that we know today as northern Nigeria. And they were very well known as centers for learning where law and theology was studied. But once the Muslim religion arrived in the 19th century, the Hausa states began to decline. The last ones mentioned are Canaan and Borno, and they're located just east and west of Lake Chad. As a state, Borno came in about 1220. Unfortunately, they did not have a stable government, although their copper mines did bring in a sense of prosperity to their people. In the the 17th and 18th century, the Muslims tried to subdue and convert them, but not much success. Complete subjugation did not come until the British arrived in 1900, when one portion came under the control of Britain and the other came under the control of France. Now your text spends the next couple of pages telling you about a few other states. Up to the 16th century, and it gives you the locations of some at the mouth of the Niger to the Cape of the Good Hope. I'm not even going to try to pronounce all those words. The kingdoms of Brahma, the Empire of the Congo, Mataman, Damara, Zulu. Now, on the eastern coast of Africa, the Matabele and Makalaka peoples were, shall we say, intimidated by the Wazembe, a very fierce island group. The remainder of the eastern coast fell easily and quickly to the Muslim influence and became dependencies of the Arabians and the Persians, which simply means that they maintained their own name and for the most part their own religion and customs, but they were under the heavy thumb of the Arabians and the Persians. And in the interior Africa, there were the kingdoms from Zambezi to Lake Tanganyika. But after Songhay had been conquered by the Moroccans in the late 1500s, the trade centers began to shift from the west coast to the east. By the 19th century, our European neighbors, France, Great Britain, and Germany were all competing for colonial power in Africa. And of course, that means simply subjugating the African states. African power had shifted from the central western area of Africa, of the flat grassland and kingdom, to the forest states along the Gulf of Guiana southward before this happened. When the Portuguese sailed down along the African coast in the 15th century, 1400s, they discovered two states, Benin, west of the Niger Delta, and the Congo Kingdom near the mouth of the Congo River. At Benin, the Portuguese bought slaves and beads and cloth, which they then exchanged for gold further along the coast. This abundance of goods impressed our European traders so much that they began to name the sections of the coast after the products, such as the Pepper Coast, the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast. But when you win a war, you have prisoners of war. So the question is, what do you do with them? Do you keep them and feed them? Or do you sell them as slaves? Selling them is the most economical way to go. The peoples living west of Benin had organized themselves into a series of states, and they broke up early in the 1800s. There was a lot of war and disorder, and which in turn led to a large delivery of prisoners of war into the transatlantic slave trade. By the late 1800s, Tahiti became the main West African center for exporting slaves. They did end the trade by the end of the 19th century, and they began to export palm oil products. Yeah, as I said earlier, this is by no means a complete listing of West African political units or states. We've not discussed Egypt, Kush, and Carthage, for instance. And these areas were flourishing well before the Christian era. And there were other states that came later, the Swahili-speaking states, located along the Indian Oceans, and they traded with India, Arabia, and Indonesia at a time the Europeans were fighting the Crusades. And of course, the Ethiopians have a recorded history of more than 2,000 years. And there is the kingdom of the Zulu peoples, which did not become prominent until the 19th century. The main purpose of this chapter is to introduce you to a few of the advanced people who had culture, laws, and a social system. And it's really from this area that we're going to begin our trip into American slavery. The whole purpose of the chapter was to introduce you, basically. But now that you've read your chapter 1, and you listened to my lecture, you may want to jump right in and answer those questions, those 3 questions from this lecture. Now, I strongly suggest you watch those 2 videos first. They may make understanding the reading and lecture a bit more easy. It's your choice, but just remember, you may only enter the assignment 1 time, even though the system will tell you you can save and return, and you can. But once you enter an assignment, the clock starts ticking and does not stop until you hit submit. So if you've got 30 minutes to do your quiz questions, and you do half of them, and you've got to run to the bathroom or your baby's crying or something, so you save to come back later, well, you get sidetracked, and you don't get back for a couple of hours. Fine and dandy. You're going to go in, and you're going to find out that the clock has been running the entire time. So when you submit after 2.5 hours of working on assignment. There's going to be deductions because you were only supposed to use 30 minutes. So the best suggestion I can give you is make sure you have the amount of time free that you're going to be allowed to do your assignment, like 30 minutes for your quizzes, 2 hours for your tests, and then close your door and get you a cup of coffee and tell your husband or wife to watch the kids and make sure you have plenty of time. Now for this lesson, you only have the 1 chapter to read, and you're going to have 20 short quiz questions. This is as opposed the rest of the lessons have 10 quiz questions. But since you didn't have an alternate or a supplemental reading to do, you've got 20 short quiz questions and 3 short essay questions. So read the directions carefully on both of them, and although you will not be kicked off the system at the end of the time limit, there will be a deduction for submitting late. I tried having it kick you off, but when I do that, it causes all kinds of problems. So all I can do is remind you to, no matter what time of the day or night you go in there, don't expect to use more time than you're allowed. And submit your quizzes, your written assignments by 10:30 Central Time on Sunday. You will get kicked off after 10:30. The system will shut down, that lesson will close, and the next lesson will open. Unless you have a test. The tests aren't due till Monday. And of course, it'll stay open till Monday for that. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. If I don't know you're having a problem, I can't help you. So good luck. And again, welcome to the class. You're going to be learning some stuff that's going to surprise you. I think you'll find the class interesting. My only regret is that I'm not going to be able to see your lovely faces.